Welcome to today's edition of The World Today on global justice, the struggle for women's human rights. And if you are as committed to global justice and women's rights as our honored guest is, I should let you know that Perry World House in the new academic year will be doing increasing program related to human rights. Our discussion today will focus on the state of women's human rights globally and explore tools, strategies, and analytic frames for advancing women's human rights and making sure that women everywhere can live as fully human and fully endowed with their inalienable human rights as possible. We've convened today's program in recognition of Women's History Month here in the US, as well as an early celebration of International Women's Day, which is celebrated on March 8th, but Penn will be on spring break then. I am beyond delighted to welcome my colleague, Rangita de Silva de Alvis, to join me in this critical conversation. She is the Associate Dean of International Affairs at the University of Pennsylvania School of Law and the Hillary Rodham Clinton Fellow on Gender Equity at the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security. She is also a leader in practice at the Harvard Kennedy School's Women in Public Policy program, a senior fellow of Harvard Law School Center on the Legal Profession, and was a distinguished advisor to former UN Undersecretary General Umzile Lambo-Nuka, the Executive Director of UN Women. Rangita, today UNAIDS released a report recognizing March 1 as Zero Discrimination Day. There are lots of data in the report about how prevalent discrimination is against many people around the world, but here's what they have had to say about women, none of which will come as a surprise to you or me or many of you in our live audience or online. But nevertheless, here's what they say. More than 50 countries maintain nationality laws that discriminate on the basis of sex. 25 countries have nationality laws that deny women the right to confer their nationality on their children on an equal basis with men. Only 10 countries across the world offer full legal protection to women. In 18 countries, husbands are legally allowed to prevent their wives from working. 104 countries have laws that prevent women from working in specific jobs. Countries that have many countries have explicitly sex discriminatory family laws. There are laws that prevent daughters from inheriting the same proportion of assets as sons in about 39 countries. And at the same time that you have this spectrum of denial of women's human rights, you also have female heads of state or government from Barbados to Iceland, an increasing number of women operating as CEOs and other senior positions within the private sector, women making advances in the STEM field, more female doctors, lawyers, and judges than ever before. Some female athletes actually getting equal pay for their athletic prowess at last, collapsing abortion restrictions in some countries across the Americas. So, while we have this spectrum of rights, we certainly have a certain degree of continued inequality, I would say. And I wanted you maybe to begin by setting the scene for why CEDAW is a revolutionary document to begin to tackle some of the problems I've just described and that the report, in fact, points out.
Thank you, LaShawn. I am delighted to be spending the very first day of this historic month, March 1st, with you because you're such a champion of gender equality and women's rights globally. And so as we look towards International Women's Day, I think this conversation is not only urgent, but it is one that is critical. You did share with us some statistics, a panoramic sweep of facts from around the world, which seem dire. And I wanted to add to that repertoire of statistics. In 19 countries, women still have to adhere to a husband obedience law. In fact, in some countries, it is enshrined in the law that there is in-law obedience. And this is where the law itself is complicit in gender inequality and women's subordination. So it is not a cultural or traditional practice, but it is a legal, normative framework that sometimes makes women subordinate, and the law itself is complicit in that subordination. But alongside of this subordination and gender inequality that is written in the law, we see a burgeoning revolution that has been pushed forward and incentivized by women's movements around the world. So a lot of these laws that are still on the books are being rolled back because of women's rights efforts and the energy of the women's movements that are building coalitions and are building important revolutionary movements. So even during COVID, even during a time of a public health crisis, women were addressing some of these challenges in the law. So for example, in Chile, Gabriella's law looked at femicide and not only decriminalized femicide, but increased the punishment for femicide. In Lebanon, during a time of COVID, when the world of work was becoming virtual, what we saw around the world was that offline violence was going online, and violence and sexual harassment against women was happening online. And the Lebanese law was changed. The sexual harassment law was changed to include in the law a provision on online harassment. Egypt, during the time of COVID, where we saw an increase in female genital mutilation for various reasons, because of lockdown orders, because of the crisis situation, there was an increase, a spike in female genital mutilation. And Egypt also changed its law to provide more punitive provisions, harsher punitive provisions, especially against the medical profession. So increasing the penalties for doctors who perform female genital mutilation. And all of these were results of very powerful women's movements who were at the forefront of calling for change. So I wanted to start with saying that the situation is dire, but there is also enormous hope. And that is why these conversations need to be trans-border. And we have to look at these transnational movements on gender equality and women's leadership. Now, LaShawn also looked at the ways in which the normative change is propelled through this movement building that happens on the ground and in the field. And that is very much what I call a dynamic that calls for this praxis meeting theory. And the theory that continuously moves the women's movements around the world is the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, which has been almost universally ratified. And only 5 countries are yet to ratify the convention, including the United States, Iran, Palau, Tonga, and Somalia. In fact, last year, South Sudan, which is the youngest country in the world, ratified the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. The United States was one of the first countries to sign this convention in 1980, soon after the CEDAW became operational in 1979. So the Carter administration and President Carter was one of the first to sign this. But what we see is that 40 years later, we are still not able to ratify what is a universal Bill of Rights for women. And this is universal in so many different ways. And I think that is what needs to be stressed, the fact that the CEDAW is first and foremost universal, because these rights have been translated into regional frameworks, including the Maputo Protocol, which is the Charter of Women's Rights, the African Charter of Women's Rights, the Belém de Pará Protocol, which is the Inter-American Bill of Rights for Women, and the Istanbul Convention, which is the Anti-Violence Against Women Rights, which was passed by the Council of Europe. So these universality of these norms have been domesticated, have been internalized and vernacularized at the regional, at the country level, as well as the local level. So that is a way in which we challenge and assail the arguments against the universality of these human rights norms. And second, these norms are inalienable. and non-derogable, that in no time can there be a way in which these rights can be eroded. So these rights are non-negotiable. And thirdly, the fact that these rights are interconnected, inextricably interconnected to the larger human rights framework, whether it is the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Convention on the Rights of the Child is the most universally adopted human rights treaty. There's only one country that is yet to ratify the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and it is the United States. And the CEDAW is also inextricably interlinked to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Article 5 and 6 speaks to the compounded nature of multiple forms of disabilities, including gender and disability. Women with disabilities face multiple, double, triple forms of disability. And reading the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination against Women with the Convention on the Rights of the Child brings to the forefront the whole effort on anti-child marriage and forced and early marriage, because although the CRC is yet to speak about child marriage, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination against Women in Article 16 on the rights to the family speaks to an age of majority for marriage. So those are the core norms of the convention. But what is so important about the convention is that there are core values that help to advance the women's movements around the world. So some of those values, again, look at the ways in which the CEDAW, the convention, applies to both direct and indirect forms of discrimination.
Rangita, I'm going to pause you right there just before we get into the values of CEDAW. I want to bring us out a little bit in order to then refocus. And I want to go back to something you said earlier, because I want to make sure we're bringing the audience along with us. One is you mentioned the word femicide, which some of you might be familiar with and some of you may not be. And so I want you to maybe talk a little bit about what is femicide and why it's so important. So that's the first. And then there's a second question I want to ask you that you can think about while you're answering the first, which is really maybe talking a little bit about why it is still the case that at a structural level, right, you have this ubiquity of violence and discrimination against women. Because it would seem that whether one is in Sweden or the US or Guatemala or South Sudan, women are experiencing some level of violence or discrimination wherever one is in the world. It's inescapable. So how have we gotten as a society to a place where the one thing you can count on is that women will be discriminated against and that there was likely violence against them in the course of their lives in varying levels? And that, so that's, and I have a third question, which I'll ask later, which is also about maybe talking a little bit about how the women's rights movement, through the very organizing that you described, has expanded notions of what human rights are and who has a right to human rights, and that it's not your traditional civil and political rights, that it includes like access to water and looking at intersectional issues. So, but to start with the definition of femicide and why everyone in this audience here and online should really care about femicide.
So in order to contextualize femicide, I'm going to answer some of your earlier questions. And that brings me to the values of the CEDAW, which is the fact that it covers both civil and political rights, but also social, economic, and cultural rights. So it pierces the veil of the dichotomy between rights, but it also, and this is one of the core values that I wanted to underscore, is that it is the first human rights treaty that deconstructs and dismantles this false dichotomy between the public and the private. So for the first time, international law saw as subjects of their jurisdiction private actors, including family members. So in Article 2E of the CEDAW, it calls for subjects of the law, that is persons, organizations, or enterprises. So it's the first time that international law saw itself looking at private forms of violence and looked at regulating private actors in addressing violence against women. So it's the first time that international law saw its role as addressing family and intimate partner violence. So this is what is important for me and sets the stage to look at femicide more broadly. Now, femicide is something that has many iterations and many ways of expressing itself. So in some parts of the world, it is called honor crimes, where women are being killed, women are being sacrificed at the altar of their family's honor. So femicide occurs when women are killed and murdered in the name of a family's honor. For some reason, women are accused or being alleged of transcending or in some way violating a code of ethics or a code of honor that is part of a family status in the community. And historically, the criminal law has thought of these crimes as exculpatory offenses and have reduced the punishment for those who are accused of femicide or honor crimes. So it is mitigating those crimes, but what it does is it renders women second-class citizens. Women are considered second-class in the eyes of the law because of femicide or honor crimes. But around the world, including what I talked about in Chile, in the Gabriella's law, there's a movement by women, for women, where laws are being changed. So in countries such as Lebanon, in fact, honor crimes were not only excused, but there were also provisions in the law that forced the rapist to marry his victim or survivor of rape in order to cleanse the crime. And that was not only an exculpatory offense, it was something that was called for under the law. So now that provision too is being rolled back in many parts of the world. So coming back to your second question, which is looking at some of the changes that have been made by looking at the redefinition of gender itself. And that to me brings us to the very, I think, the most critical part of our discussion, these changes that have been brought about by, and that is why both of us look at the important role that women's movements and social justice movements play in these transformational movements. So in response to the Me Too movement, as well as the Black Lives Matter movement, there has been a global public reckoning. And against the backdrop of the social justice movements and against the backdrop of the crises that that are still evolving, the crises and the conflicts, the crisis, the health crisis, as well as the economic crisis, there have been changes looking at some of the structural, the systemic, and the institutional challenges to gender equality and the systemic and the structural nature of violence against women. And moreover, that is now being looked at through the prism of intersectionality, that women are not only identified by their gender, but that gender is only one axis of difference, and that gender is often compounded by race, color, sex, identity, rural-urban divide, disability, and age. So these are a non-exhaustive category of differences, and that intersectional argument is really key for some of the transformations that we are seeing around the world. And to your question about structural change, I think the structural change brings us to what are the root causes of some of these challenges. So I come to this discussion after a conversation with some of Afghanistan's leading women's rights advocates. And one of the provisions that they fought for in drafting their decree on prevention of violence against women is that they created 22 categories of violence. And one of the categories of violence was denial of education. Now that's really making structural changes, systemic changes to understanding what are the root causes of violence. So denial of education is one of the most important ways in which the systems militate against women. And you destroy education, you destroy a nation, you burn down a school, you burn down a woman's dreams. So it is important for us to look at some of this structural and systemic nature of these challenges. And that happens, LaShawn, as you know, only when women sit at the table. Historically, these laws have been drafted by men and male hierarchies, and issues that are so critical to women have been outside of the spectrum of the laws, including critical issues such as reconciling work-family obligations. And that is what we are seeing, that COVID-19 has brought these issues right to the center of the debate, and the importance of looking at work-family not as these dichotomized separate worlds, but worlds that need to be reconciled by both women and men. So there is around the world a new awakening looking at how family leave policies can really advance the notion of equality both in the family as well as in the world of work, and that men need to be part of that movement.
So I want to highlight a couple of things that you said. We'll talk for maybe 5 or 6 minutes more, and then we're gonna, so get your questions ready. Again, we've got a live mic over there, and we have people online. So I think one of the most important takeaways from this conversation is for those of you in the audience here in person, and those of you online, to understand that women's subordination around the world isn't accidental. That's the first thing. And I presume that if you're sitting in this audience, you know that and you believe that. The other thing is that you can remedy it. There's a solution to women's human rights abuses, even though they're ubiquitous. And I guess another point is that, and that it's our duty, it's actually our duty to examine that. And that part of what CEDAW does, and part of Rangita's work over her lifetime, has really been to repoliticize women's rights work. I might be putting words a little bit in Rangita's mouth, but I don't think so. And here's what I mean. If women's human rights work at its core is about women's full humanity and their agency, meaning their undisputed right to make decisions about their lives, their bodies, to participate in civil society, to be safe walking down the street, to have full access and opportunity, then it really does mean revolutionizing society as we know it. So the person who tells you, and if you believe sitting here, that doing women's rights work doesn't mean examining and re-examining everything you think, then you won't do the work and you won't be successful in the work, because it means contesting power dynamics. It means contesting markets. It means contesting women's economic subordination all over the world. It means contesting the way that women's bodies are deployed for different reasons. And CEDAW and human rights conventions all over the world offer an entry point for women's rights activists around the world to get organized around these subsets of ideas. But these ideas are actually very connected to create the very structural issues that Rangita has actually talked about. And so I want to move for some minutes to talk about kind of 3 main areas that you've done a tremendous amount of work on, in terms of CEDAW having both domestic application and utility in the United States, even though we haven't ratified it, being central to discussions about peace and security, and genuinely being, and I'm going to sound like a proselytizer here, like this incredible document that offers a roadmap for how to bring about meaningful change in all aspects of women's lives. Like, if you haven't read it, go online and download CEDAW and download Rangita's article. But maybe we can start with just some of the domestic application and then move to peace and security. And we'll end by talking about its transformational nature. And then I expect to see people at the microphone, and I will have questions online as well.
Thank you. So I am going to come back to the 3 points that you have identified from my article, but I want to go back to the point that you raised about contestation and the contested nature women, of the challenges that women's movements around the world have forged. And one point that you omitted from your long list of the ways in which
many points I omitted, no doubt.
Which women challenge state authority and challenge employment structures and ecosystems. One most important contestation is the contestation of culture, culture and traditions. And that has been at the forefront of the struggles of women around the world. And that culture and tradition have been hijacked by male hierarchies and patriarchies and misogynist elements in society. And it is that women are now reclaiming culture and tradition and their faith, whatever the religious tradition, and feminizing it and providing a more progressive, more up-to-date reading of whether it's the Quran or any other religious text. So most often what we find is that these male interpretations dominate the dominant discourse, and women have been shut out from this discourse, and women are now reclaiming their place at the table in rereading these religious texts in order to advance and find meaning and hooks for the rights that they are advancing. So they are using both the CEDAW as a roadmap, as a blueprint, but also looking at a more progressive, a more modernist understanding of religious texts on which to anchor their claims.
And can I just say, you have no idea how powerful this is, how powerful it is that women interpret religious texts and integrate their well-being into those texts and take command of that. Rather than being the subjects, they are the agents and they're exercising their agency. It's an extraordinarily powerful thing that's being done.
So a lot of what is happening in Afghanistan is the Taliban reading the religious texts as a way to legitimize what is going on, the marginalization of women and the prevention and the denial of education of women. But when women reclaim their space, what they say is, this discourse belongs to us. And a reading of the Quranic text, the very first words of the Prophet was read for enlightenment. And he didn't make it a gendered provision. So reading and enlightenment is very much ingrained in the Islamic text. So how do you read that? How do you interpret it in a way that a feminist interpretation, a progressive, a modernist interpretation is very transformative and has the kind of legitimacy and the credibility among large groups of the people, right? So you have both the secular human rights doctrine as well as the religious texts on which you can hinge your claims and your rights guarantees. So going back to the issue of the three major pillars that I argue in the article, the very first is the ways in which for long, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination against Women has been posited as an important foreign policy tool for the United States. And I quote someone whom I claim as an authority in this field, the former dean of Yale Law School, Harold Koh, who was the chief human rights officer under the Clinton administration and the Obama administration, where he says that we have eroded our moral leadership on the global stage by not ratifying the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination against Women. In our article, we go beyond that to say that this is important as domestic policy. It is not only an important foreign policy tool, but it's an important domestic policy tool, especially at this moment in time where the Biden administration is using the intersectional argument as a way of relief and recovery in a time of COVID. And again, in the bill that he passed on anti-Asian hate crimes laws, again, he brings an intersectional perspective to that. So given the fact that intersectionality is now writ large in our own domestic policies, it is important for us to align these policies to the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination against Women. And my exploration looks at 5 years of reports, over 179 reports, and looks at how in 100% of those reports, the CEDAW committee speaks to the importance of intersectionality, whether it is the rights of Aboriginal women in Canada, the rights of Afro-Brazilian women in Brazil, whether it is the rights of the Swedish first citizens. And so we see that in every country, there is an effort to look at not just gender as the central issue, but gender plus. So to look at gender and its intersectional identities and the ways in which gender is only one axis of difference. The second provision that I look at is the importance of the Women, Peace and Security agenda for the United States. The Women, Peace and Security agenda has been to a large part advanced by the United States leadership in this arena. And in fact, it's a bipartisan agenda for the United States.
Can you maybe talk a little bit about the tenets of the Women's
the Women, Peace and Security agenda was first introduced in the Beijing conference over 25 years ago, but it was only in 2000 that it was recognized formally as an important agenda by the Security Council itself. So the Women, Peace and Security agenda for the first time recognizes women not just as victims of war and conflict, but as agents of change, as agents of peacemaking and peace building at the table. So the WPS agenda looks at three pillars. One is the participation of women in peace building and in resolving conflict and in sustaining peace. Secondly, it looks at prevention, the prevention of conflict and the role that women play in avoiding conflict. And that is probably the most important pillar, but the most neglected pillar, because most often when we look at the indicators and the causes of conflict, we omit to our peril the ways in which violence against women, trafficking of women, sexual harassment and sexual abuse of women are important indicators, are important early warning signs around the world about the harbingers of conflict. But because of a masculinized, militarized approach to the WPS agenda, we only look at issues such as stockpiling of arms, right?
Or demobilize soldiers.
Or the soldiers at border control and border patrol. But we omit to look at some of those human rights indicators, those women's rights indicators that are early warning signs of conflict and war. So I look at the ways in which the United States has been at the forefront of the WPS agenda. And I look at one case study where in 2008, Condoleezza Rice, Secretary Condoleezza Rice, introduced 1820, Security Council Resolution 1820, which for the first time defined conflict-related violence against women as a security issue, one that called for the focus and the engagement of the Security Council. So this was historic, and this was introduced by Secretary Rice. A few months later, in early 2009, Secretary Hillary Clinton introduced 1888, Security Council Resolution 1888, which strengthened Security Council Resolution 1820 and called for the installation, called for the introduction of the office of the Secretary General's advisor on conflict-related sexual violence. So you see the ways in which there was a bipartisan effort on the WPS agenda, while at the same time omitting to ratify the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination against Women, which in General Recommendation 30 and in General Recommendation 19 speaks to those very same efforts and very same issues. So there is this kind of paradox that needs to be addressed and resolved. So I use the WPS argument as a way in which we can encourage the United States to ratify the CEDAW, that a reading of both brings together a more holistic understanding of both our foreign policy and our domestic policies. And then the third pillar is that I look at both the kind of shifts from soft power to smart power diplomacy. And I argue for what I call transformational diplomacy, where we are looking at a completely revolutionary understanding of diplomacy that looks at the intersectional aspects of this and the role that women and women of color around the world play in advancing women's rights, but looking at the ways in which women's rights are inextricably interconnected to other rights, such as the rights of women of color, the rights of women with disabilities, the rights of marginalized, underrepresented women. And that's what we are talking of when we are speaking of women at the decision-making table. Are we looking at women as a monolithic, or are we looking at women who are underrepresented and whose voices need to be heard the most?
We're gonna move to questions. I promise this, and now I really will ask one more question, and then I would hope to see people at the microphone or questions. And I have this iPad here that I'm glancing down at, but it's because I'm looking at questions, not because I'm not paying attention. So a zillion years ago, when I was at a human rights organization doing women's rights work, I remember being so excited the first time I read through CEDAW completely. And one of the things that I was excited about was that it wove together, in my mind, kind of every aspect of women's rights: cultural, political, civil, economic, sexual, etc. And I was like, this is revolutionary. But it also had this small article in it, Article 9, and we did quite a bit of work around this in Beijing. It was about nationality, because I had never imagined, growing up in the US, that there were places where women could not pass on their own nationality. Because, for example, if they'd married a foreign man, that the offspring of that union would get the nationality of the husband rather than the wife. And it moved me so much because I thought, is there anything more central to your kind of agency and your legal status in the world than to be able to confer something, first of all, to have rights of your own children, but then to confer something to them. And so much of what CEDAW does is so fundamental about what is it to be genuinely, fully human and to have agency, which I think a lot of people take for granted all over the world. Your ability to walk safely down the street without being harassed, your ability to pass on your nationality to your child, your ability to marry or not whom you want, your ability to make decisions about your body and its use, your ability to participate in the civic and electoral life of your country, to help your country be the country that you think it should be, without being subject to other people's command and decision-making. So I wanted you, Rangita, before we move to questions, to maybe pick out, I shouldn't ask you this, what your favorite article of CEDAW is, but maybe to talk a little bit about which one was a transformational experience for you when you read it or saw it for the first time.
So I'm going to build on Article 9 because you raised that. That is an important article, and still 19 countries deny equal citizenship rights to women. So as LaShawn explained, if a man marries a woman of a foreign nationality, he automatically transfers his citizenship rights
and
to
all
his
the
offspring.
benefits of that, right? This is not without consequence.
Access to education, access to healthcare, access to all of the resources. But if a woman marries a non-citizen, a foreigner, then she is unable to pass her citizenship rights to either the husband or to her offspring. So what happens is you're building a group of second-class citizens in a country, so who do not have access. So it becomes the face of poverty. You're feminizing poverty in these communities, especially in geographies in crisis, in geographies in conflict, where there's a huge migration of people. So what is happening is the Rohingyas who are going to Burma are unable to pass on their citizenship rights equally to their children. So you're creating a second-class group of people who are going to be potentially create even more conflict. And these are the kind of what I think are the root causes of conflict, the lack of access to resources, lack of equal access to citizenship. So going back to that issue, again, it's women in these countries who are fighting for equal rights. And I was just early on the week with the ambassador to the UN from Botswana, sharing with him his own, this important case from his own country, Unity CEDAW versus Botswana, where Unity CEDAW had married a foreigner and she was a lawyer. So she brought this case to court and they challenged this unequal provision in their nationality law that disallowed her to pass on her citizenship rights to her children. And it was very important that they chose this provision to challenge, because they were trying to challenge some of the unequal provisions in the legal system. And they chose this because this was something that was very democratic, in the sense that this was not only about, women in the urban areas marrying men from the global north, but this was something that affected women in the border, in the hinterlands of Botswana, where they were marrying men from the adjoining village who happened to be from a different country, right? So this was something that affected peasant women and agricultural workers. And this was something that they challenged in the court, in the Supreme Court of Botswana, but also they challenged this in the field. This was something that really united the women's movement on building a common cause, on bringing on a joint commitment to gender equality.
Was that the Unity CEDAW case?
The Unity CEDAW case in Botswana. So just the most recent challenge to this came in Malaysia, where the Malaysian women challenged this in the Supreme Court. And just a couple of months ago, this provision was removed. So yes, so around the world, there are movements to challenge these cases, challenge these provisions, unequal laws in the Constitution. So you asked me for what my most important and favorite provisions.
Rangita, briefly, only because we've got several questions from Zoom that I know we'll want to get to, and several in the audience. So
yes. So Article 2, I already talked about it, the way in which it revolutionized not just the CEDAW, but human rights law and international law, because Article 2 now has dismantled this artificial distinction between the public and the private.
Do you all understand what Rangita means when she says the dichotomy between the public and the private, that there was a time when the state understood its obligation in terms of protecting, that obligation stopped in a home, for example, right? That it argued that it couldn't protect women from violence in the home because that was a private matter in the home. And their responsibility as a state really was about state functions and activities of the state rather than of individuals. Is that clear to everyone? Okay,
so two other revolutionary articles that form the value system of the CEDAW. One is Article 4, which speaks to temporary special measures. That this is an article that to some extent transforms affirmative action. So temporary special measures call for substantive equality. So it is not just equality of opportunity, but equality of result. We're really looking at the transformational nature of equality, that we are looking at not only bringing women and men to the start line, but making sure that women are brought to the finish line. So equalizing the playing field by providing temporary special measures. And these temporary special measures have been revolutionary around the world. So for example, in Senegal, using Article 4 of the CEDAW, they drafted it in 2010, a parité law, which now has increased the number of women in parliament to 45% of women in parliament. So it has a radical effect of equalizing the playing field. And this is not about charity. It is about looking at historical power differences, historical, the historic nature of discrimination, and trying to address the legacy of discrimination against women. And these historical power differences, with its sexism, racism, or colonialism, is also written deep into the CEDAW. So this is about correcting historical power differences and about redistributive justice. And then Article 5 is revolutionary too, because it calls for addressing stereotypes and addressing cultural and traditional practices that subordinate women. So just think of this. In 1979, there was an international human rights normative framework that addressed gender stereotypes as part of the corpus of the human rights framework. How revolutionary and forward-looking is that? So in 2021, what we're dealing is with the second generation of discrimination against women, which are these subtle biases and these subtle stereotypes. In 1979, the CEDAW saw fit to address it as a human rights violation. So these biases, these subtle and nuanced forms of biases and stereotypes are part of the corpus of the human rights framework. How advanced, revolutionary, and forward-looking is that? And that has really helped us to look at some of the most important areas that for a long time were invisible in terms of either international law, human rights law, or employment laws, such as, you know, very gendered family leave policies. Family leave policies that prioritize women as the primary caregivers, rather than equalizing caregiving opportunities and privileging the rights of both men and women to give care, and thereby equalizing gender and family relations in the most intimate sphere, in the domestic sphere, but also making sure that women and men can maintain equality in the workplace and in the political sphere. So to me, that is really revolutionary. It is normative, it's constitutive, and it is transformational.
Thank you. Okay, so as promised, I'm like 30 minutes late doing this. I'm gonna move to questions from online. So the first one, I won't read it word for word. I'm gonna do a summary, and hopefully for the person online, I do your question justice. But it essentially is about how you would encourage men's initiatives to lead behavior about the advancement of women's rights and to change views of masculinity. And the person who poses the question points to the He for She campaign as an example. So your reaction to how men should be included, not necessarily an evaluation of the campaign, but what, can you talk a little bit more about how you encourage men to be a part of solutions?
So this to me is the most, what I think is the most critical change in the global women's movement, because for long, the global women's movement has seen itself as very much an insular movement. And it was important for that period in time that women connect and women coalesce. But it is time now to expand this movement to ensure that women's rights are human rights now and for all times, and that men are part of this human rights campaign. So the He for She movement provided us with a language, a vernacular to speak to this. But moreover, there is, I think COVID has now brought to the forefront the importance of men and men's role in disrupting the workplace and in disrupting the orthodoxy of the family. That women have, there's been a shift where women are now once again moving out of the workplace because of the caregiving crisis that has been launched by the COVID-19 crisis. But we are seeing at the same time that both the employers as well as the state are coming together in rewriting labor laws. So ensuring that men are also caregivers. And so it is to some extent, you know, what I called, what Sweden calls caregiving by gentle coercion. So the law is driving men by providing paternal leave, mandatory paternal leave in many countries, especially in the Nordic area, where it's mandatory, it's a carrot and stick. If you don't take it, you lose it. So you're creating a new generation of men who to some extent are being coerced in at the beginning, but then they see themselves as fathers, as caregivers, sharing the equal duty of caregiving. So that is a very important part of the He for She campaign, but it's also where we see around the world new laws, whether it is the Maria da Penha law in Brazil and in other countries that are using the whole role of men as a way of addressing not just punishment of violence against women, but the prevention of violence against women. So you're writing into the law the role of men and the role of young men and the education of young men and young boys in the prevention of violence against women.
So I have one more question online. I have a closing to do, and if we don't finish at 5 on the dot, they may fire me. So I want to make a brief comment, and then I want to move to a second question. I have a slightly different response to that, and I want to say it very quickly. I think there are different ways that men can be involved in advancing women's rights. I think one of the most important ways they can be involved is talking to other men and to calling out toxic masculinity in all its forms and gender stereotype, because the noxious effects of that are tremendous. And so I kind of use a race analysis when people ask, like, what can white people or other people do about anti-Black racism in this country? They should talk to other white people when white people are doing racist things and saying racist things. Similarly, I think it's very important for men to call other men out when they are behaving in toxic and discriminatory ways, and that behavior should not go uncommented upon and engaged as an opportunity for transformation and change in our communities, that all of this begins with us in our families, in our communities, in our individual circles where we reach and touch people. And on that, I'm going to ask you a final question, which is not an easy one. We have a question online that really talks about the fact that CEDAW centers cis women. And by doing so, is it leaving out and behind the discrimination against those who identify as LGBTQ, trans, and non-binary?
Right. So, this was a document that was drafted in 1979, but I do think of its interpretation as a living, dynamic one. So the CEDAW is a living document because the interpretation remains dynamic. And in many countries that use CEDAW as a blueprint in drafting legislation, uses the terminology, the vernacular. You give a whole non-exhaustive list category of intersectional identities, including disability, sexual identity, and other. So that leaves the door open for the interpretation of these growing categories of identity. And the fact that these are evolving categories, that every generation sees an evolving category of gender, is something that has been acknowledged by the CEDAW. And as I said, this is a 1979 document that is brought up to date by interpretive tools that are proposed through the general recommendations. So up to now, there are 38 general recommendations, and General Recommendation 28, General Recommendation 18, General Recommendation 14 speak to the intersectionality argument that looks at these differences that intersect with gender and compound the discrimination and the violence against women. So yes, so there are these challenges in the language of the CEDAW, but CEDAW, like the other human rights treaties, must be read as a dynamic living document. So with that, I wanted to end, LaShawn, by thanking you and thanking our guests, including a few of my students whom I see in the audience, and they are the next generation of human rights advocates. And I wanted to say that the charge is yours. The charge is yours. The CEDAW ratification needs to be universal if we need to see human rights and women's rights as universal and inalienable. And I want to end with a quote from Louis Henking, who taught at Columbia Law School, where he said, in the Cathedral of Human Rights, the United States has been more of a flying buttress than a pillar. So it is important that the United States claims its role as a pillar in the Cathedral of Human Rights, and that we see the fierce urgency of now in the words of Martin Luther King. So it is there is a fierce urgency at this moment in time that we ratify this universal global Bill of Rights for women.
And so I've got a couple of things. That's a hard thing to follow. So it's going to be a little bit anticlimactic, but I will do it nevertheless, which is that so Rangita and I have known one another for many, many years, and you won't find a more dedicated, steadfast advocate for women's rights than you will find in her. It has been both my honor and pleasure to have you here at Perry-Wohlhaus and to have you as a colleague from the law school. I have further announcements that I want to pause and give her a uproarious round of applause. And obviously,
may I just jump in? I want to qualify that statement she made that she called me a colleague. I think of her as a beloved friend.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Friend and colleague. And hopefully part of what you've gotten out of this is that there is a world of possibility and that you are responsible in this world. Nobody gets to take a pass. Whatever the thing is you're working on, I hope it's women's rights, but that you're fighting against injustice, and more important, you're fighting for the establishment of a more just world, because I think that's what all of us want here. So I wanted to thank the audience online. I wanted to thank the audience in this room for joining us at the World Today. We hope to see you again soon. And here's how you can see us again soon, both in person and online. So first of all, tomorrow on Wednesday, March 2nd at 4 p.m., and all of this is East Coast time, we're going to have an expert briefing on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It will feature the Philadelphia Inquirer's columnist, Trudy Rubin, who just returned from Ukraine, Perry-Wohlhaus Lightning Scholar and Temple University Assistant Professor Jane Vainman, and University of Pennsylvania Professor Rudra Sil, and former US Ambassador to Russia, Alexander Vershbow. They will all be right here on this stage tomorrow at 4 p.m. Next week, on March 14th at 4 p.m., we will be hosting the former Prime Minister of Sweden, Carl Bildt, who will be giving a wide-ranging discussion on the state of the world, including obviously what's happening in Ukraine, but also what's happening in this semi-post-COVID environment, but not quite. On March 15th at 5:30, we will be featuring Iranian-born filmmaker and artist Shirin Nishat with our colleagues at the Arthur Ross Gallery for their Susan T. Marks Distinguished Lecture Series. It will be extraordinary. It's a part of our Global Lens program. And again, that's on the 15th at 5:30. For those of you who are in person, you are welcome to join us for a light snack, a grab and go snack in the student lounge. You can always follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram. We have dropped, I hope, links in the chat function to access Rangita's paper and RSVPing for some of the events. And we thank you, we wish you well, and we hope to see you again. Be well.